Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Long Game Podcast with me, one of your hosts, Jason Osborne, and my esteemed co-host, Ben Scallon. How are you doing this week, Ben?
I'm doing great. A little bit hurt that your live stream did so well and that you are now appearing. I mean, we started this podcast aiming to overtake John and Sarah, and now it appears you've decided to overtake me as well. So I'll just be in absolute last place, having achieved none of my year's objectives, but that happens, I suppose.
I think that's overly optimistic on my behalf. I mean, that image, I mean, if I'm overtaking you, I'm also overtaking myself, so it'd be an indictment of both of us. But I do have that image in my head of the meme where there's a guy standing behind himself with the gun. It's like coming up. In second place is Jason Osborne and Ben Scanlon. In third place is also Jason Osborne.
You somehow just, yeah, it's like a time travel paradox or something.
That is, I will shamelessly plug the live stream now that you bring it up, because I have started doing that on Wednesday evenings, just because we're always looking for more content, and we figured this is a good way to do, I'd say, deep dives on some occasions. That was what I was trying to do last Wednesday in terms of responding to the Minister for Finance, Pascal Donoghue, and what he had to say about government essentially not having that much of a role to play in terms of pro-natalist policies or anything like that. But I think it'll really just be because, you know, in the US and in the UK and everything, there are loads of solo shows and live streams and things like that. And in Ireland, we haven't really tried that so much yet. Or if we have, they haven't been very long lived. And indeed, that may be the fate of what I'm doing, but no harm trying. Nothing ventured, nothing gained. So that's just a shameless plug. Wednesdays at 8 p.m. And indeed, that'll be the case this Wednesday, barring any extenuating circumstances. But with that plug out of the way, this week we wanted to kick off, Ben, with institutional failure. Is that a fair way to summarize what we're going to talk about? Beginning with the BBC and the difficulties that's presently going through, which you summed up in an article this morning. So would you give us the latest details on that?
Yeah, so as some people may have seen, the Director General of the British Broadcasting Corporation, the British BBC, has stepped down from his role, as has the head of news at that organization, because a very good investigation by The Telegraph is after discovering that they did a BBC Panorama documentary about the January 6th riots in America, where a lot of Trump supporters were protesting the certification of that election. And so they went and they ended up rioting and so on and so forth. And the BBC took two parts of Donald Trump's speech and they cut them together to make it sound like he was saying we should go to the Capitol and we should fight like hell, when in reality, the two things that he said were over 50 minutes apart, almost an hour difference between the two comments, but they selectively cut them together to deliberately, it seems deliberately, make it look like he was saying something that he simply he didn't say, and
you
give the viewer that
as well that,
impression.
like, it wasn't a strategic edit or anything like that. Like, they didn't make clear at all that they'd done this.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't, like sometimes you have to cut stuff for brevity in news. That's normal. That's fine. And we do this all the time in Gript. I always go to great lengths when I'm doing that to include a flash of white light between the cuts so that you can see there is a cut here. I'm not trying to deceive you. I'm not trying to hide anything. I'm just cutting out part of it because we don't have time, or that's not relevant, the part in the middle, something like that. They didn't do that in this instance. It just clearly looks like he said something that he didn't say. And the reason this is significant, this is a huge controversy. The BBC hasn't really explained why. And the reason this is so fascinating to me in particular is we're always told about how the BBC and RTE and NPR and all these other state-funded media outlets are so important to combat misinformation and disinformation and to try and preserve the truth, have sources that are trusted that we can go to if we're in doubt about certain things, and that now that misinformation is rising, it's more important than ever to have public service broadcasting. How many times have we heard this? And you see instances like this and you realize, how does getting funding from the government insulate you from being wrong? If you want to be really charitable, you could just say they were mistaken. You could also go for more nefarious theories as to what's going on there, and their actual agenda. But the point being, none of them have ever been able to satisfactorily explain what they mean when they say that. I've asked so many Irish politicians. I asked Pascal Donoghue. I asked Catherine Martin when she was the media minister. I asked Micheál Martin when he was the Taoiseach. How does the state giving money to a news outlet make that outlet more trustworthy? And they kind of shrug it off, or they scoff, or they act like it's a silly question. Like I asked Pascal Donoghue and he kind of said, I'm going to have to pause before I answer that question. And he had a little kind of a titter about it. And I asked him, do you think that Virgin Media is less trustworthy than RTE because RTE is state funded and Virgin Media isn't? And he just didn't answer it. He kind of just evaded the question or went around it. So anyway, I just thought this was another example of that, and just how ridiculous it is that we're supposed to put our total and utter trust in these sorts of institutions.
Well, you make a good point about the mis and disinformation thing, because the trouble with institutions getting into that kind of game is that they really do open themselves up for criticism in future when they sort of appear to selectively avoid dealing with or covering certain topics. Because when the Telegraph, the day after the Telegraph released this expose, because indeed, as the background to it is the Telegraph got a hold of an 18 or 19 page internal memo to the BBC, which had been produced by the sort of BBC Standards Committee, which found this insane panorama edit, as we say, that they did with Donald Trump, but it also found a number of other things. And it essentially was saying that, things seem to be in some ways really bad inside the BBC. And this was huge news last week when it broke. It went around the world. Obviously, got response from America and things like this because it was directly concerning their president. But our media, to the best of my knowledge, by the next morning, had nearly uniformly failed to comment on it or to address it, which is amazing because we're normally very quick to pick up on the failures of the UK in many ways, but this one was just sort of universally left untouched. And so I wrote just a quick comment in response to it saying, for the gatekeepers of truth that RTE and indeed the rest of our media keep positioning themselves as, they've been very quick to leave untouched one of the biggest sort of institutional failure stories in a long time. Because again, the BBC positions itself in the UK much as RTE does in Ireland, which is as sort of this guardian of truth, to use the phrase again, where you can go to get certified.
Sorry, Jason. You see, the problem is the Journal would have liked to cover it, but their fact checkers were too busy chasing some guy on Telegram who no one's ever heard of, and some crackpot claims he made. They have to debunk some granny in Roscommon who made a Facebook post 2 weeks ago. It's critically important that they do that. They'll get to the BBC when they have time.
Posted a picture of Simon Harris and Micheál Martin as two cheeks on an arse, and they have to do a debunk. It's like Simon Harris, Micheál Martin are not in fact cheeks on an arse.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, no, so you're right, but it is funny. Like it's trivialities and things like that they're busy concerning themselves with when you have an absolutely massive institutional story so big that as I said, I forget the position, the director and the head of news both have stepped down as of this morning.
Yeah, and also the chairwoman is having to issue an apology to their arts committee or something, sending a statement apologizing on behalf of the organization. Not explaining why it happened, by the way. I don't think even now they've given an explanation or a justification. They've said, oh yeah, it was wrong and it shouldn't have happened. But why did it happen? Were you intentionally trying to mislead the public? I'm not accusing you of that. I'm just asking what was going on there. They haven't opined on that yet.
Yeah, and so the bottom line here is that this is a really big story, and they sort of strategically avoided it. I mean, I speculated in my article that a decent reason anyway, RTE left it untouched pretty much until they absolutely had to touch it, which was today. If I remember correctly, this morning I did see RTE covering the fact that the director and the head of news had stepped down. But like at this point, you have to touch it. I mean, this is a huge thing engulfing the British broadcaster. So they couldn't avoid it any longer. And I was speculating anyway last week as to why they hadn't touched the initial story, which, as I say, was huge anyway and was being much commented upon. Now, I was thinking that it raises too many questions that RT would much rather leave unaddressed regarding, you know, potential institutional bias, a lack of sort of accountability or relationship between the viewers and the broadcaster, where you've, like in the case of the BBC, you got a broadcaster that kind of felt itself justified to put out whatever it wanted. And it was only when it was pulled up on the basis of this internal memo that there's finally been some accounting for it. And you kind of have a similar dynamic in some ways in RTE, which is that we've seen time and time again, and you know, scandals engulfing RTE, and it's not until they're exposed later that it's like, oh, you know, okay, something has to be done about this. And even then, like I say, RT in some ways is even more egregious. I mean, who could forget that, you know, the former Director General Dee Forbes still hasn't, to my knowledge, really responded in any way to the role she had to play in, the potential role she had to play in anything concerning sort of Ryan Tubridy and the governance authority at the time, back when it was 2023, those sort of scandals were coming out. She sort of pled ill health, and since then she's remained sickly, I suppose, as the story goes. So to the point that even like Fintan O'Toole wrote an article last year saying, like, come on now. She kind of has to in having occupied the position she occupies, she has to come in at some point and speak to the Oireachtas and, you know, account for what went on in RT. But to my knowledge, she still hasn't. So while that's of a different variety of problem in a major institution, you know, you're speaking kind of management and financial doings in RT's case, it's still the case that these organizations receive massive amounts of state funding, which comes from the taxpayer. Let us not forget. It's not like, you know, it's this bloody free broadcasting or something. It's people's taxes going towards keeping these things up. And the idea that you can just swan off after causing problems or being involved in an organization that was causing problems is ludicrous.
Yeah, I think that's something that people have kind of forgotten about, and that everybody says, you know, oh, I like one of the things that you'll hear now from RT reps and the minister is that, oh, we've got massive internal change and we've reformed the way we purchase things and we deal with our contracts and so on. And so that whole dark saga won't be repeated. And that may or may not be true. That remains to be seen, and we'll see what happens in the coming years. But whether that's true or not, I find that hard to believe personally, given that it is a state body which is inherently inefficient. But let's give them the benefit of the doubt and say that's all behind them. The fact remains that it happened in the past, and there are still people who I believe should have to answer questions about why it happened, what their role was in it, if anything. And they essentially have gotten off scot-free, which, as a taxpayer, I'm not thrilled about. I don't think that that's acceptable at all. And I think there's probably many other people who feel the same way. So that sort of brings us on. We wanted to talk a little bit more broadly about the failings of our institutions at a wider level, and specifically we wanted to talk about the motherlode of all woke NGOs, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, that state agency. What's the newest on our friends over at IREC, Jason?
Yeah, so the reason that this one is worth, in the context of like, what's the best way to, the most charitable way to put it, if you want to be charitable, which I think we do, sort of institutions not being, I suppose, what they ought to be in a sense, or Anyway, I'll give some of the details of this and let our viewers decide for themselves before we comment on it.
Before
So
you,
last week,
apologies, I know I just asked you the question and now I'm interrupting you already, but just very briefly, for those who don't know, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission is a state agency which was set up many years ago, and its job is to basically make sure that human rights are advocated for within the state, which sounds great, right? Like, we all love human rights. What's wrong with that? That sounds perfectly reasonable. But they are ultra woke, and their interpretation of human rights always involves undermining society in some fundamental way. So, for example,
well, I'll
this
put it
organization.
this way:
Go ahead.
when I was looking for a picture to put on the top of my article about this last week, I was scrolling through IRX X account, and one of the most recent posts I saw on it was a speech that their chief commissioner Liam Herrick, if I'm remembering correctly, gave, and the caption they had on the post was "Trans rights are human rights." So it's like, this is the level of human rights advocacy you're talking about here, which is to say, a load of bullshit.
That stuff like that, and also stuff like suing the government for failing to house asylum seekers within a certain time frame once they arrived in the country. So if an asylum seeker comes and the government says, well, look, we don't have anywhere to put you, and the person ends up homeless, then IREC sues the government. A state agency is suing the government, and this is an organization that we fund with our taxes to the tune of millions of euros. That's the organ. This is actually what you're dealing with. This is protecting human rights so far as the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission is concerned. So anyway, that's neither here nor
Yes.
there. That's just to give a little vignette or background as to the institution we're actually speaking about. Apologies, Jason. Go on.
No, that's okay. I mean, a cynic might say that it kind of is the human rights organization you might get if you had a human rights organization that neither cared where the concept of human rights came from or what they're for. But anyway, the reason they were in the news last week is because they announced that the government had recommended 6 new commission members to the commission, and I was making the case that these people strain the definition of the word independent would be an understatement. So I'll read out some of the biographical the people and some of the biographical details of the people, again based off the article that I'd put up last week. So one of the 6 proposed commission members is Sam Blankensy, I believe I'm pronouncing properly, who's the current equality officer at Maynooth University, who previously worked with the Irish Traveller Movement and 10 Eyes, the Transgender Equality Network of Ireland. And based on the biographical details they were providing, Sam appears to request they, them pronouns. So that's just for our viewers' consideration. Then you had Catherine Costello, who's Professor of Global Refugee and Migration Law at UCD, University College Dublin, that is, my alma mater, with an extensive academic background. Most interestingly, it seemed to me, she had previous board member experience, including as a member of the board of the Irish Refugee Council. Then, very interestingly, the Taoiseach's brother, Adam Harris, who was being reappointed. He's also the founder and CEO of the autism charity As I Am, and he's also sat on the board of directors of one of Ireland's most powerful NGOs, which is how you branded it, Ben, Rethink Ireland, which does enormous work on the sort of NGO civil society scene in Ireland, delegating money to different social enterprises and NGOs and things like huge amounts of money. So, pretty influential guy being involved in these various organizations in any capacity. Then you had a 4th member, a proposed member is Rosaleen McDonough, who's done board experience at Pavy Point and Women's Aid, and she's currently on the boards of the Arts Council, which, again, like, you're hearing all these organizations names, like the Arts Council has itself been embroiled in all sorts of issues over the past couple of months, which a quick Google of the organization will reveal. Not saying obviously that she's responsible for that in the slightest, do not get me wrong. I'm just saying that she's on the board of the organization. Then the second last you have is, and she'll forgive me if I mispronounce her name, Patricia Munatsi Mangwiza, who's a human rights lawyer and also a member of the government's expert advisory committee on racial equality and racism. She had input into the National Action Plan Against Racism, which I would be of the opinion is a seriously problematic document, having loads of anti-racist assumptions and things as it does, and giving credence to nonsensical concepts like unconscious bias and all of these things that other countries have started leaving behind. And she also advises a special rapporteur, Dr. Ebon Joseph, who readers may or may not be aware of. She's also Miss Monatsi Manguiza is also a member of the board member of Uplift and a member of Lawyers Against Racism Ireland. And then last but not least is Rose Wall, who's a solicitor and consultant specializing in environmental justice, who has got lots of senior leadership experience from across the NGO sector. So I was essentially making the point, you've got that lineup with all of the experience that I've just outlined. And I was making the case that to say that this is independent strains the meaning of the term independent. Now, am I accusing them of misdoings here? No, I was saying they're probably independent in the technical sense of the term required to actually be eligible for the appointment as a commissioner of these organizations. But the idea that these people don't carry with them their own kind of, agendas, their own kind of vision of equality, sustainability, diversity, all of these things is utter nonsense. I mean, you just have to look at where they're all coming from. Like TENI, massively controversial organization, working on NAPAR, the National Action Plan Against Racism, massively controversial document. All of these things should be up for public debate, but they haven't really been over the past couple of years. They've just been, rubber stamped and given funding by the government out the wazoo. And sure enough, anyway, all these people are, proposed by government then into the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, which, as I also outlined in the article, is important because independence is a key part of IREC's composition. In their own about section on the website, it says that they work independently of the government to protect and promote human rights and equality in Ireland. And as I said, when many of these organizations these people work for or are involved with have received varying amounts of state funding or administer state funding, in the case of Rethink, they've been involved in carrying out controversial works done by the government, and their various roles have spent the better part of the past decade working hand in glove with government to advance their specific agendas. You can see why I'm calling into question the notion of independence in this context. Maybe it's a symptom, as I also said on that occasion, maybe it's a symptom of Ireland's parochial nature. But the fact that the same panel of names keeps coming up in all of these influential organizations is like doing a lot to undermine the word independent in Ireland. I mean, I just don't see how it could be otherwise.
Well, what's critically important to note about all this is that the government are going to propose people like this. The government proposes a bunch of woke activists to staff various state agencies. And then after they've appointed those people, they're then shocked when those same state agencies start coming out with strange proposals that the government then has to defend and that cause them problems and headaches down the line. And a great example of this is we have Sinead Gibney, who's the Social Democrats TD. But before she was a Social Democrats TD, as many people will know, she was the head of the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission for several years. So Sinead Gibney is a government appointee. They put her into that position. They gave her prominence and they gave her that role prior to her political career. And just there on The Tonight Show on Virgin Media last week, she was debating against Fine Gael TD Nisha O'Murray, and basically they were talking about housing, and Sinead Gibney was saying how we need to build more houses, we need to ramp up construction, and so the Fine Gael TD was saying to her, "Yeah, where are we going to get the labour from? What's the plan here?" So Sinead Gibney said, "Oh, we'll bring them in. We'll have like foreign labourers come in," and then Nisha O'Murray was kind of saying to her like, Yeah, and you'll have nowhere to put them, so you're going to bring them in, and then there'll be nowhere for those people to live. Like, hello, Earth to Sinead kind of thing. This was his general demeanor and his vibe. Like, look at this absolute space cadet. She clearly hasn't thought anything through. And you could agree with that. You could say, oh, yeah, no, Sinead Gibney's plan is totally ridiculous and silly and off the wall. You're the one who appointed her. You thought that she was credible enough to make her the head of a state agency with a budget of about 7 million quid. So who's the real idiot here? If you think she's an idiot, then why are you putting idiots in charge of majorly important state agencies? So, wouldn't that make you even dumber than her if she is indeed what you say she is? Like, it's just unbelievable how they like we've seen now, and we don't want to relitigate it because we talked about it all last week on the podcast, but the government's pivot towards common sense on migration and on various things, and Heather Humphreys saying she wasn't keen on trans madness and blah blah blah. Yet, if you're still putting people who do believe in those things into key roles and positions at every available opportunity, don't be surprised when the pendulum keeps swinging in that way. Like, what is wrong with you people? I don't understand. Sorry, you were going to say?
No, well, no, I was going to go on a bit of a tangent because I mean, it go like, well, that's veering in the direction of the absurd. Like, you do have the outrageous. I do think that the sort of IREC appointments are pretty outrageous, but it goes from the outrageous then to the absurd, which is, I say, that debate between Sinead Gibney and Nisha O'Murray. That's heading more so in that direction. But I would say it's a more innocuous example of this sort of toxic cross pollination that keeps taking place all over Ireland. But it might not be any more innocuous. I mean, I do think it contributes to sort of this ridiculous culture that we currently have, which was, again, to return to RTE, actually. I don't know if you saw over the weekend the single worst post I've ever seen on X. Do you have any idea what one I'm talking about?
That doesn't narrow it down at all, unfortunately, no.
Yeah, no. So the one I'm thinking of, and of course I'm using a bit of hyperbole here, but it's the late show's tweet where they said Holly Cairns is in the building with the sort of raised hands emoji, like, you know, raising the roof. And I was like, is anyone surprised she's in the building? Like, was this was this unexpected? This idea. So it's like, is this sort of, again, I don't know whether it's Ireland's parochial nature, as I said, or whether the fact that we have a fairly small pool of these people to draw, or at least the people in the position of a authority who run the controls of the platform seem to think they have a small pool to draw from, and therefore they don't look beyond them. But so the Late Show, obviously RT's flagship show, organization that receives a lot of funding, and they're trying to get hyped about the leader of one of the opposition parties coming into their talk show to say what seems to me like I didn't watch the show because I had better things to do with my time, but seems to me, based on what I have seen, that it was, you know, what critics of Holly Cairns might say is a load of nonsense. And yet they're trying to hype her up like they got Beyonce or something like this to fly in from the US. So
you know what? Maybe
yeah.
maybe the shock, maybe the surprising kind of novelty was not that they were having Holly Cairns on, but that they were not having Mary Robinson on. Maybe that was the new kind of shock value. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw it, and like I drafted the response, and one of my kids, thanks be to God, distracted me from spending time on X outside of work hours. Where like, I was like, the only suitable response is some, like, the spirit this is coming from is kind of like, oh, you know, oh guys, this is so exciting. They've got Holly Cairns in, leader of the Sock Dems, the Young People's Party. It's like she's literally in the building. It's like, it's just this vapid, D4, to use the term, even though, you know, my accent might not distinguish me particularly well from that crowd. Hype that is completely disconnected from the rest of the country. Like, no one cares that you got Holly Cairns, other than, you know, Holly Cairns' dedicated supporters, which is admittedly fairly limited in number. So I don't know. Yeah, I took a swing in the sort of absurd direction, but it's like this is all kind of the same dynamic. We're coming at it from different directions, which is that there's a real lack of imagination in Ireland, in Irish institutions. I won't say there is in Ireland. I think there's a lot of imagination out there, and you can see that in different places. But the institutions and the people in the institutions are looking at the same sort of narrow selection of people, the same narrow selection of views. These are actively worsening our institutions. Like, people might think this is laughable. I do think, the Late Late it is an institution. You broadcast that to the whole country. Imagine you actually started broadcasting something worthwhile to the whole country. Some of Ireland's best, they'll say, oh, we do have Ireland's best musical talent. It's like, okay, well, so you say. Some of Ireland's best thinkers, some of Ireland's best commentators, like, I think even people on the left would say that the Late Late isn't providing those things. So there's sort of consensus across the spectrum that, our institutions are failing in various regards. And I just think that this is a real problem. But and it's not a victimless problem either, as the next thing we wanted to cover heads in the direction of, Ben, which I think you have more details than I do on that.
So yeah, we also wanted to talk about this news that just got released a little before we started recording, that according to new figures, over 28,000 children in Ireland are waiting to see a primary care psychologist, and over 15,000 of those have been waiting for over a year to see a psychologist. And as of last August in Dublin Northwest, there were some children who were waiting up to 13 years for an appointment. And you have to remember that we're talking about the HSE, which has had its budget more than double in the past decade. Like, what is it up to now? 25 billion, something like that, in and around that. And
Something like that, yeah.
and like, it sounds almost comical to say you were waiting for an appointment for 13 years, because whatever was wrong with you, you probably either it's done you serious harm, or like irreparable harm, or you fixed it yourself in that time. You know what I mean? Like, it's the idea of waiting 13 years to see a psychologist. Like, let's say the kid's 5. But he's 18 now. Like, I think whatever issues he was dealing with when he was 5, I'm not sure you're going to be much help to him anymore. So yeah, like, this is what your tax money gets. Keep paying those Scandinavian taxes, folks, to make sure you get these sorts of results and outcomes. And he was talking about a totally different situation. It was about immigration or something, but I thought Patter to be in a vein to him. He had a really good line, which was, he said, he was criticizing Jack Chambers, I believe, and he said, if you take the future tense out of your statements, there's pretty much nothing there. There's nothing of substance that you can say, because you've been in charge for so long. Like, if I was to confront a government minister about this issue right now and say there's tens of thousands of children who are waiting for psychological help and you haven't been providing it, they would say, oh, look, we're doing this and we're working on that and we're hoping that that comes to fruition and blah, blah, blah. But the fact of the matter is, it isn't. It hasn't come to fruition. It's not here. And how many thousands of children have suffered as a result of that? Like, it's just outrageous.
No, it is. It is absolutely sickening. And as I say, these institutional issues are not some victimless talking point, or, something that people who have gripes with the state, just sort of gas about. Like, these are real issues. And the most culpable, certainly political parties in all of this, are Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. There's no way, because in various constellations they've been in power in and out of for the past decade and a half. Well, much longer than that. But like, you see posts, this drives me crazy. You see posts, like, they put up a post on X on Friday, Fianna Fáil, this is, celebrating the fact that their minister, Norma Foley, had delegated something like 1.5 million euro to LGBTQ plus organizations across Ireland. And I had a look through the funding. I was like, there's a load of, I disagree with the whole agenda anyway. But even if you didn't, I feel like there would be a load of crap in there you could disagree with. Like one of the projects they were funding was for Men's Aid Ireland. I'm doing this off memory. And it was something to do with like understanding intersectionality in some sort of LGBT context. And it's like, okay, 1.5 million, I can't remember exactly how much it was, is a drop in the ocean in terms of how much money the government is spending every day. The whole thing is, it's about where the focus is at. It's like, you've got huge painful problems like this one you've just cited, massive waiting lists that, yeah, children waiting up to 13 years to be seen by a primary care psychologist. That seems like a pretty basic thing a lavishly funded state agency ought to be able to provide. You've got a political party that's had plenty of chances at the reins of power in the country, and you look on their social media page and it's like, as often as not, they're talking about, oh, a free contraception for this group, more money for LGBT organizations over here. And it's like, how about you guys shut up until you like get the basics under control? And I do feel like this is what's it's the same dynamic, not just in Ireland, but elsewhere, that is making young people more radical. I'm writing a comment article to this effect at the moment because, Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil are speaking all about essentially how their future lies with the young people. Emer Higgins, the day after the presidential election, had said something like, what this has really taught me and Fine Gael is that we need to connect more with young people. An insight that, hardly an insight, something that was echoed by Billy Kelleher just yesterday, saying that, we need to reconnect and re-engage with young people more. And it's like, they speak about it as though the big issue here is simply that the connection between their party and young people has broken down, and not so much like what they're offering is the reason why young people have broken off the connection with these parties. They never really sort of consider the fact that it's maybe the substance of what they're offering that's completely unappealing to young people. I'm not saying here at all that every young person is a closet conservative or anything like this. More so that we are living in kind of radical times where young people are always a little more radical than older people, obviously, right? Because they've less at play. Like they don't have families, they don't have assets, like they don't have properties and things like that in normal times, and so they're sort of free. They have the capacity to be freer with their opinions. Whereas once they start having families, once they start having properties and things like that, they generally start looking to rock the boat a little less. But I do think this dynamic is just heightening at the moment because people can't get homes later and later. People are starting families later and later if they start them at all. And so people are capable of being sort of genuinely left wing or genuinely right wing for much longer. And it's all just to say that, like, this thing, like, this problem with the health service in Ireland, of which the waiting lists, these 13-year waiting lists are just a symptom. That's a radical problem. So don't be surprised when people start looking for radical solutions. And it's the same with housing. It's like the Department of Finance, I think it was, issued a warning last week that they predict Ireland's housing crisis to last for another 15 years. And it's like, but that's I'm turning 30 next year, but that's I'll be 45. Like that's essentially a world of, like, 15 years ago I was 15. I'm in completely different places every 15 years. So, like, sorry, Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, you guys don't have 15 years to sort these problems out. The winds of change are blowing, and one way or another, someone else is going to capitalize on that.
Yeah, and the thing as well is that I think they need to stop talking down to young people in a certain sense. And I don't have some romanticized view of young people. Like young people, and
Yeah.
I include myself in this. I'm 28 years old. I am less wise now than I will be when I'm 60, if God willing I live that long. That's not a poor reflection on me. That's not an insult to young people in general. It's just a fact that when you gain life experience, when you have children, when you have a long career, when you go through all these different things, you're obviously going to be you're going to have better intuition, better
Uh,
instincts
such as
than
such is the ideal of aging, we should say.
exactly. Yeah, I mean, of course you can age wrong. You can go about life in a poor manner that leaves you dumber than when you started if
Find
you really
yourself
want
singing
to.
Imagine with Catherine. Find yourself singing Imagine with Catherine Connolly in Galway by the time you're 60.
So there's all kinds of wrong ways to go about it, but in an ideal scenario, you should develop as you get older. And what that means is that of course younger people are not as wise as older people. That's just obvious and shouldn't be controversial. So I'm not trying to big young people up to an unreasonable degree or gas them up and say, "Oh, how dare you criticize younger people or something." But I do think when the government the subtext when they say we need to appeal to young people by doing all of this stupid crap, they kind of are selling young people short in a sense, because one of the benefits of being young is that you're very open-minded, and that can be a good thing, it can be a bad thing. Obviously you can be too open-minded about certain things, but like to speak from personal experience, I was a communist in my teen years, or in the very early teens. That made perfect sense to me. I heard about the idea of a centrally planned society, and everybody to each according to their need and from each according to their ability sounded perfectly sensible to me. And then you get a bit older, and now I'm a devout Catholic. I totally and utterly oppose the edicts of Marx and so on and so forth. So the only reason I bring that up, all that is to say, is that young people will consider lots of ideas. You don't have to just spoon feed them swill. You can say you can get them to think about ideas that are quote unquote off the wall, that an older person who's maybe a little bit more set in their ways wouldn't be willing to consider and would just kind of reject out of hand. And that's something that I think is not ever discussed when we are talking about how to appeal to the youth. Like, young people don't want to just hear their own views repeated back to them. Like, they want to be intellectually stimulated and to hear
Yeah.
new ideas, radical. I mean, you've already made the radical point, but yeah, stuff that is energetic and different to what they already are aware of. And that's used to be what
Stuff that's
university was about. Of course,
exciting.
it's not like that anymore.
Yeah, like I think, young people are generally speaking more passionate. So is it any surprise they want sort of, they're sort of they're much more vital. And I can say that, like, an 18-year-old already has a lot more kind of youthful energy than even I do. As like a guy turning 30 with two kids. Like, you're not going to find an 18, like, gosh, when I was 18, you do like 18, 20, you do crazy things like go for a night out in town, and then I don't know, just because you're having a good time, you'd walk home along the Lewis tracks all the way home. Like, it's literally from the city centre for me all the way out into South Dublin towards the end of the line. And it's like, you think I'd do that now? No way. And it's like the difference is that the sort of youthful vitality about you that just disappears, and that also has an effect on everything, has an effect on political outlooks as well. So there's definitely a difference. But I do think that we're relatively youthful. All of that said about our kind of aging state in life. And in that capacity, I do think that we do maintain some sort of radicality about us. And I think where I would like it to shine most in my life is definitely, yeah, in relation to my faith, which is that, I think that generally speaking, radicality, you kind of have to be careful with it. But one area that you can't be too radical is in terms of, loving and desiring to become a saint, which is obviously my ulterior motive, if I can be described as having one as a Catholic. And it's in that spirit that I thought we might turn to the last topic, which our non-religious listeners will either turn off or listen to with gritted teeth. But for those of you who, yes, are maybe a little more open-minded, you might find it interesting, the sort of the internal conversation in the church in Ireland, because, contrary to all of the hype, I do think that I think the religion, I've said this on the podcast before, I think the religion in general is a much discarded trend over the past 20, a much discarded phenomena over the past 20 years by Western minds that is going to shape, it's never going away. It's going to shape certainly Europe and certainly Ireland over the next couple of decades in an unbelievable way. And I do think that the church has a huge role to play in that, because we've also talked about before, and there's been many articles in Gript and elsewhere about this require revival going on, and that really is something. And there's a whole load of ways in which this is interesting, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. I was going to issue a bit of a, no, an exhortation is too strong and also too lofty a way to put it, but express, I suppose, my exasperation a little bit with the church hierarchy in Ireland. This doesn't come off the back of any particular news story or anything like this. You might nearly say it comes off the back of a lack of news stories related to the church hierarchy, in that I get emails from the Catholic Communications Office because I'm signed up to their mailing list, like so many other organizations. And I got exasperated last week when I saw them issue I have it here in front of me, a press release about how at COP30 it is vital that Ireland demonstrates moral leadership. And it's a statement from one of the bishops who, people can look up if they want. I'm not going to say it because I don't. The purpose here isn't sort of direct people's ire at a particular bishop, but looking at the comments that he offered, or at the statement that he issued, this isn't anything that couldn't have come from a government body or from a well-funded government NGO. This isn't to say that like contrarianism is what the church hierarchy ought to be aiming for, but it is to say that you and I both believe the church is supposed to have a prophetic voice. It's supposed to, say something to a lost and ailing world. And my contention here is that increasingly, I feel like the church hierarchy in particular in Ireland is only willing to say things that other people are already saying in an effort to minimize the blowback or the fire that they receive. I understand why they do this. Being a bishop is a very difficult thing. I worked at the Irish Catholic for a couple of years, so I do get the nuances of being a bishop, that, you are, as we would say, shepherding souls. You have a lot of weight on your shoulders. And Ireland is, I would say, quite an anti-Catholic climate currently in many ways. So, if you become a firebrand bishop and you start just shooting off statements ill-considered, you can potentially make things a lot harder for your parishioners, ultimately the people in your diocese, because they ultimately have to answer for these things. But I would come at it from a position that the bishops in Ireland couldn't lie down any more than they have, and that hasn't done anything to stop the media from demonizing Catholics, making fun of Catholic beliefs, doing this and doing that. And I don't come at this from a perspective of like us poor Catholics, leave us alone. I come at from the perspective that we ought not to let that atmosphere, that attitude dissuade us from speaking the truth. And I think very often it does. And like before we went on air, I was getting exasperated again because I was explaining to Ben that I was scrolling through all of the communications that I get from the Catholic Bishop's Office. Many of which I've deleted already at this stage because they're just of absolutely no interest. And like my eyes just settled on one from a couple of weeks ago, or something like such and such a bishop prays for good weather ahead of the ploughing championships. And I was like, guys, come on. We live in an age, to go with like young people again, young people are ailing in so many ways. Like they're politically disenfranchised. Loneliness up. Suicide very high. Social atomization extraordinarily high. You got gender ideology at play. You've got the very contentious immigration issue that the church has a lot to say to. That, again, whenever a member of the church hierarchy does decide to speak on it, they generally issue a statement that you could have read in the Irish Times, that you could have read, that could have come from like a Fine Gael or a Fianna Fáil backbencher or something like this. And it's like, as I say, you want to address the hierarchy in a charitable way, because I do appreciate they've got a very difficult job. But as a young Catholic, I think I can say this isn't good enough. As Catholics, you're supposed to be bold. You're supposed to be prophetic. And I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say next to nothing prophetic in anything that they have to say on a public platform. If they feel personal offense at me saying that, um, I would say that in and of itself is a problem. This isn't personal. This is more so a debate about, how to make the church more vital. And this isn't say this. I'm not at all saying here that bishops ought to become really right wing. In fact, I'm saying quite the opposite. They ought to be, I suppose, like Christ, so that extreme rights and extreme lefts don't grow amongst the youth. Christ himself was a really radical and bold figure. And it's like, I just do not see any of that in the hierarchy at the moment. And the reason I felt like addressing this now is just because, as I say, I'm getting these inane, boring press releases week after week that say absolutely nothing, it seems to me. And it's like, I get the desire not to rock the boat, but sometimes you have to rock the boat. There are loads of things going on in Ireland at the moment that merit rocking the boat a little bit, and the church is prime position to do so. The church in Ireland doesn't have anywhere further to fall. Like, what's to stop them speaking out? So take this maybe as just sort of an expression of exasperation from a relatively young Catholic who definitely submits himself to the church but finds himself a bit fed up by the institution.
I will say on a kind of more positive note that this might sound like a silly trivial issue that maybe if you're an older person watching this, you're going to say, come on, like that's not that serious an issue. But I think it's an immensely serious issue, and I'm very glad that the Pope just recently spoke about it. He was talking about addiction, and he was speaking about various kinds of addictions, the obvious ones like drugs and alcohol and so on. And one that he mentioned was video game addiction among young people. And again, you could look at that and say, who cares? Big deal. It's not that big a deal. That's a huge deal among young people. There are young men in particular, men and women, but mostly men, who waste away eons, the huge chunks of their life, just
Yeah.
playing video games endlessly all day, every day. It holds them back in school. It holds them back socially in their relationships. It makes them lazy and lethargic. It damages their attention span and their ability to focus on something in front of them or read a book. And that affects millions and millions of young people. It probably affected me at one point when I was younger. I don't know if I was ever addicted. I don't know if I would use that word, but
I definitely was. I can testify. Funny you should bring that topic up. I was literally thinking about this yesterday, about the hours and hours that I wasted. And don't get me wrong, I had fun, but a good life isn't built just on fun. A good life is built on good things, which I believe the church ought to promote and uphold.
exactly. And so I think the fact that the Pope would speak about that and try to address that issue that is affecting young people, I saw that and I thought, this is the kind of thing that the church should be talking about. Obvious ones like pornography and abortion and all those other ones. All that you kind of expect that from the Catholic hierarchy, but that's the one that kind of cuts to the core of things that are relevant to young people. That I think there's a lot of young men who know that that's a problem. If you ask them and said, "Do you think you play too much video games, and would your life be better and more productive if you rode back on that or cut it out entirely?" I think a lot of them would say, "Yeah, but I really want to play Call of Duty. I really want to play FIFA or whatever it is." And if the church was engaged in more of that stuff, now we're cooking with gas. That's getting into the real issues, not good weather ahead of the plowing championships. But absolutely.
Yeah, no, that's a really good example because that's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about. Like, yeah, having been a teenager, within the last decade, there are so many issues that the church could speak to. This is a really good one. Another massive one that it could speak to, indeed, that a lot of lay Catholics do speak about, but again, the bishops are. And again, I don't want to be only negative. I know that the bishops think, to put it this way, in the Catholic sense, properly about all of these issues. My issue would more so just be a lack of boldness or courage in terms of addressing them in the public square, which I think would do a lot of good. They have my prayers, and they have the prayers of pretty much every Catholic that I know. But it's just this, it's like pornography. That's another one. Pornography is a massive issue that every so often you'll see, the odd column about it in a newspaper, but it remains taboo. I don't think the taboo is broken on this one yet. I think people bring it up and then it's just kind of let slide. But this is one that is genuinely destroying lives, and that people with platforms ought to be speaking about a hell of a lot more, because it's like it's invisible. The reason it can keep going, it can keep hanging on there, is because it's invisible and people are ashamed to talk about it. And this is one that, yeah, the church absolutely can speak into. And obviously, you're going to have the critics who come along and say, oh, the church has no place telling people about, anything to do with sexuality, as like, particularly in light of like abuse scandals and things like that. And it's like, from the business perspective, after a certain point, the church has taken the right sort of repentant approach after the scandals of the past, and it should continue to be repentant about those things. Indeed, that's the mode of being a Catholic. You repent of your sins and realize that you're always prone to sin again. The thing is, you have to not let that hold you back. You have to be bold. It's like, despite the failings in the past in the church and there, shouldn't let it stop them from proclaiming the truth of the church's vision of human sexuality again in the future. But that's just one example. Like there's pornography. Say, like, Pope Leo has mentioned that he's going to be addressing massive things like social media and artificial intelligence, which are genuinely warping the way young people interact in a negative way. As again, immigration is another one that there's a lot more active debate on in the US, where you've got, say, I hate using these terms, but people will generally get what I mean, left-leaning Catholics who seem to think that to turn away any immigrant is an offense to human dignity. And then you've got kind of right-leaning Catholics, and again, I hate using these identifications, but people will get what I mean, who say that no, the church has always had a tradition of saying that nations have a right and a responsibility to their citizens to uphold immigration law. And it's like,
and like
there's a full spectrum of input there that just to say the church bodies and church figures could have, that doesn't happen in Ireland. All you get in Ireland is that whenever anything, the debate flares up, you'll get something, as I said, that could have been in the Irish Times or could have been anywhere.
Yeah, like not to. I'm not gonna even name the person because I don't know. I don't want to name him. I'll just leave it at that. But there was a clergyman. He was not Irish and he's not Catholic. He's of another Christian denomination. But anyway, he's kind of prominent online. And I remember there was a video going around about a year or so ago where there were a lot of illegal boat migrants who were trying to land in Spain or some Mediterranean country, and the local authorities in a kind of a police speedboat deliberately like crashed into it and like hopped over it, and they like destroyed the boat basically, like popped and I don't think anybody was hurt, but the boat sank and they all had to be like taken out of the water and stuff. And there were like loads of people online being like, "Oh yeah, that's what happens. We need more of that. Don't let them in. They're all illegals and blah blah blah." And this guy who's supposed to be like a Christian leader retweets it, and he was agreeing and chiming in, saying, "Yeah, more of this. This is great." And I was like, there could have been babies on that boat. Like, what are we talking about here? You know what I mean? Like, as a Christian, I'm as opposed. Like, first of all, I would deport everybody. Like, you're not allowed to come to my country illegally on a dinghy, trying to circumvent the law in that way. So not one of those people would be allowed to remain if I was in charge and I had my way. That doesn't mean I want to see them run over with a speedboat with no regard for who's on board. Is there a woman with a newborn there? Is there a 99-year-old woman there? I don't know who's there. I don't know. Like, it's just incomprehensible that a Christian, self-described Christian, I understand why a secular person would feel that way, but that's just madness to me. So anyway, yeah, to your point, I think that's why one of my favorite Jason Osborne quotes that I've since utilized, that I always give you credit for whenever I'm having a conversation, is, if you think you don't like the religious right and you find them annoying, just wait until you run into the irreligious right and see how unpleasant that is. But and that's no offense to any of our viewers who aren't religious. I don't literally mean every single individual, but what happens when you take right wing ideology and you remove the ideas that you should be merciful to your enemies, that you should be charitable and helpful to the poor, and you should turn the other cheek. When you subtract all of that, all you have left is like a radical, extreme form of right wing mania, basically, which is not good for anybody. And the same in the left, and the same for any kind of political thought.
Yeah, no, you're 100% right, and like you could get a whole podcast out of a. Funny enough, I have the Wednesday slot now, so maybe I will end up discussing some of these kind of things on it. But you could discuss that a lot. But this is the whole point. It's like if the church forsakes its prophetic voice, it's leaving people out there at the prey of more predatory ideologies on both the left and the right. And again, I kind of resent nearly the fact that, like, immigration is the topic of the day. I do think it's really important that countries get it in order because it is directly fraying social cohesion. Do I think it's the most important thing in life or the most important thing facing the West? No. My answer to that question will always be godlessness, the lack of Christ at the center of culture. And that answer is never going to change no matter what situation societies find themselves in. I think that's the root of their problems. But yeah, lest we go on too far, because we're hitting our hour mark, which I think is usually the sweet spot. It's just exhortation from a friend, I suppose, to be a little bolder, because like I was even reminded of it earlier today. I think it was a newspaper clipping from a while ago where, or it might not have been from a while ago. It was making reference to Father Sean Sheehy, who of national infamy a couple of years ago. He was the priest down in Kerry who gave that homily in which he decried essentially the LGBT, everything related to that, and said that in the church's eyes such behavior is sinful, and he was right about that. I listened to his homily. I haven't listened to it in a long time, but I listened to his homily at the time and thought he was maybe a little bit like loud in terms of how he said it, but I honestly couldn't say that the content, if I remember correctly, I didn't think any of the content was wrong. I thought maybe there was a bit of an optics issue in terms of how he said it, but as I said, the content was like by and large fine, and it is not the sort of thing he should have been thrown under the bus by the church for. But indeed, he was thrown under the bus by his bishop. This newspaper clipping that I saw reminded me, remembering correctly, that he was delisted, I think, from sort of saying masses publicly and things at the time, to let it all die down. I don't think I'm incorrect about that. As I say, I was only reminded of this morning. And it's like, why are you giving that ground? It's like the people that you're trying to appease with that kind of thing aren't going to be happy with even the mildest Catholic position on these things. Never mind the sort of, fullness that Father Sean Sheehy expressed. So, and like, I do think that, as I say, priests can be imprudent in terms of how they express certain things or how they choose to address them. But even so, it's not the sort of thing that your bishop should throw you under the bus publicly over. That's the kind of thing that you can discuss in private. And I think the readiness to do so only speaks to the fact that there's a lot of concern to appease people who are never going to be appeased. And indeed, that isn't even the right way to go about sort of solving the culture issue. So anyway, I digress. But unless you had anything to add, Ben, I think we're pretty good for this week.
No, we won't torture heathens any longer and have them. You can just tell their skin is sizzling and they're howling in pain on the bus or wherever they're listening to this. So yeah, we'll put you out of your misery and say we will catch you all again next week for another episode of the Long Game Podcast. And make sure to check out Jason's live stream on Wednesday.